They that have power to hurt, and will do none, that do not do the thing they most do show, who, moving others, are themselves as stone, unmoved, cold, and to temptation slow. They rightly do inherit heaven's graces, and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and owners of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence. The summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though to itself it only live and die. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. They that have the power to hurt, and will do none. You had mentioned that you had seen some connections to Lear in that, and I was curious about Lear because it's one of my favorite plays. Is it reference to the second section of that sonnet with the flowre?
Yeah, what occurred to me about it was that there might be a connection to Shakespeare's investigation of power, right? That those who and his interest in the unjust or just use of power, also probably I think connected to the themes of mercy and justice, which show up in Lear, which show up in Measure for Measure. So it made me think of somebody, those who have the power to harm. Right? Who don't, right? I thought of political corruption and the way in which Shakespeare often references the injustice of political systems. The key one in Lear is key passage in Lear is Act 4, Scene 6, I think, where Lear, after being broken down really and by his experiences and kind of entering, I think, what we could call a kind of existential crisis, realizes that he's not attended enough to the miseries of the poor and the disadvantaged. And it's when he's in this encounter with Edgar disguised as poor Tom that he says, I have to pay more mind to this. But when he goes through that I think the process of, is man no more than this bare forked animal, when he realizes that never having been exposed to nature, never having been exposed to a kind of destitute and unprotected state, that he undergoes a kind of change in his perception. I mean, simply put, I think he gains empathy. And I think the key passage is when he talks about arms sin in gold and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks, armed in rags and a pigmy straw doth pierce it. To me, that's one of the most kind of powerful images in Lear. It begins with him asking Gloucester, have you seen a beggar run from a cur? Right, and then he goes on to say, you've seen the great image of authority, dogs obeyed in office. Right, and so to me, it's a profound moment in the play because it's followed up by Lear then making this, to me, is a kind of incredible statement that none offend. So I think he kind of realizes, because the human systems of justice are flawed, then punishing anybody is irrational. Right, and so I'm off the track a little bit of the sonnet, but I think
in a way, I mean, that was what would lead me to the second question was the fact that the first two quatrains of the sonnet, the use of the word they rather than he, which comes in the second half after the break, it gives it a more general, almost as if there was some fear behind bringing this up in a direct way by saying, rather than he or you, they that have the power to
Like
hurt.
he's protecting himself from or shielding himself from being perceived for that kind of political criticism, in other words.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think Shakespeare does that often, right? He kind of conceals the political critique in ways that cannot be traced to a direct criticism of Elizabeth or James to follow, right?
Okay.
So yeah, he couldn't say she.
Right.
Would be Elizabeth, right? Yeah, I mean, I think one reading of it is a critique of political corruption.
Okay.
But
Okay.
obviously.
But
there's
when you
other
go
ways
into
to
that
read
break
it.
with the flowre,
Yeah.
and I've read so many people that have said, how puzzling that is and how
Yeah.
abrupt it is. Mm-hmm. Do you make a connection there? We made a dramatic connection when we worked on the sonnet and set up a dramatic situation.
Yeah.
And I made a connection to a situation with Peter.
Okay.
That made sense to me.
Uh-huh.
But it is a difficult transition.
What was your?
Well, it was another tack. In other words, we turned it into a dramatically motivated piece of theater.
Right. Okay.
So I was taking one tack with him by saying, this is you. I'm not saying it directly. They that have the power to hurt, and will do none.
I see. Yeah.
And then I'm not getting through.
Yeah.
So where do I go from here? I get more direct. And I say, summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though to itself it only live and die. And it's an entirely other tack, and then it's a question of whether he gets that. As two ways of getting through to him about yielding to a sort of a temptation that I think is a mistake.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's dramatic in the sense that you think about to whom it's addressed, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, either way, it's a poem about corruption. There's also this interesting idea at the beginning of that sonnet that's curious, is that those who have the power but are somehow have mastered it,
Right.
and will not be corrupted, are better than those who are, since that corruption will reek, right, as more, right? There's that reference to weeds too, right? Even weeds will.
Right. The basest weed outbraves his dignity. They that have the power to hurt and will do none. These people are masterful and unsurpassed, and everyone else is,
Well,
even
that makes sense,
someone
because I
like
think
that.
Shakespeare's also interested in those who have that authority, right, and convey that idea of virtue, but yet are actually easily corruptible. So, in Measure for Measure, for instance, there's the character of Angelo, who is so he's in there as a representation of a kind of Puritan, right? Who has a puritanical view, has a view of justice, of being uncompromising, no mercy, and yet he easily succumbs to the same corruption that he wants to execute somebody else for. And so I think Shakespeare's often interested in those kinds of hypocrisies. So I think reading the sonnet that way, as it's both referenced a role of a piece, it's not too separate, it's the same person who has fallen.
Yes.
I think then that would be the interpretation that they're not so separate. That there's not really a turn. We're talking about the same.
A break as it would appear.
That's right. So it may be a warning of sorts, right? Which makes sense.
Cautionary.
Especially since I think in Measure for Measure, it's cautionary. There are other places we can look to see investigations of mercy and justice, and encounter characters who are see themselves as virtuous, but are looked upon negatively. So, Twelfth Night, Malvolio is another example, right? Do you think that because you're virtuous, there should be no more cakes and ale, right? I mean, he's a perfect example of somebody who wants to, impose his kind of unhappiness on everybody else, right?
It's a good
another example of that. These are comedies, but it's still the undercurrent of Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure is actually pretty serious topics being investigated through the comedy, as they all are, most of them. Yeah.
So, John, is your sense of Shakespeare that as he's writing this sonnet cycle, presumably to at least one individual and about several that he himself is also arranging it to have these political implications. I mean, I tend to agree with you that he was smart enough and always multi-layered enough that it would be almost silly to say, well, we're imposing that upon it. You don't really have to think that way because it's Shakespeare. He's always doing more than one thing. Am I right about that?
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's always multiple. There's always, I don't know how else to put it, there's always 7 or 8 balls in the air at once, right? And all these things that he's writing about are all being addressed in different ways. So the political, I think we're on very clear and firm ground to talk about political issues in Shakespeare's work. I don't.
There's a flexibility
He's
there.
dealing with it. He's dealing with it throughout. Why would the sonnets be some kind of separate realm where he's not introducing the same problems or talking about the same problems? We don't know when all the sonnets were composed. I mean, I think some people suspect that the lyrical period where he's writing Richard II, Midsummer Night's Dream, and Romeo and Juliet all consecutively, or all in that period at least, is when he might have composed a lot of them, and that makes sense because they have thematic relevance there. But I don't think the political readings are imposed at all. I think that Shakespeare's interested in all kinds of things: gender, race, class. All those things are on his radar screen. He's interested in the subordination of women in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's clearly a kind of political dimension there. I mean, I think when Theseus says of Hippolyta that he wooed her with his sword, we should read into that a political dimension. When Theseus tells Hermia that she should think of herself as a figure in wax for her father to figure or disfigure at will. Clearly, Shakespeare's addressing gender. Hermia is rebelling against patriarchal authority, and that's political. You can't really look at Othello without looking at race. I mean, Shakespeare chooses a Moor for a reason, right? And chooses an outsider who can then comment on, I think, the hypocrisies of Venetian politics, or really the hypocrisies of English politics, which is what it's really about. So I think that Shakespeare is deeply engaged in political readings and critiques of his society on multiple levels. And his concept, what I really think is that his genius is to understand cultural paradigms.
Okay.
And to be able to identify competing voices within those paradigms so that he can hear the voice of women. And in Othello, he can have Amelia represent so powerfully the plight of women and give it voice. I think not only does he see the cultural paradigms, but he has such depth of empathy and imagination that he can also understand how those who are subordinate within those systems, he can hear their voices, he can testify to those voices in a convincing way. So, we hear women speak of their condition.
Yeah.
And even in that wonderful speech, Shylock's speech in Merchant of Venice, right, we hear the condition of the outsider, right? I mean, that play is such a difficult one to deal with, but I think Shakespeare is addressing, right, the kind of anti-Semitism of Europe in some way. He sees it, he's understanding it as a cultural paradigm. Maybe he doesn't get out of it compcompletely, but he's certainly aware of it. So he gives Shylock a voice.
Yeah.
Those are
It's not completely wooden. He is getting inside.
It's kind of authentic, right? In terms of being able to see how different people operate within cultural systems and how they respond to them. So that, to go back to Lear, I mean, Lear is able to, because of his experience of being disenfranchised, even though he disenfranchises himself, he begins to see something, all right, that he hasn't seen before. He gains insight, into the lives of the destitute, those who have nothing, literally nothing between them and the forces of nature, right? And he can begin to see it, and then Shakespeare can show us. Right? Even though Lear doesn't have enough time in the play to really develop that empathy, Shakespeare has it.
Right.
Give it to us.
Right.
Yeah.
And by bringing Lear on to the cusp of dementia, how do you think that changes the language and the insight? Do you get is it closer? More permission for poetry? Yeah. More permission for imagery.
Yeah,
To
I think
reach
madness
into,
is a useful device for that, right? And in a Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare has Theseus sum up the experience of the four lovers in the forest, dismissing it actually, but he says, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. So madness and poetry and love, the madness of love, are all sort of associated with one another. There's a kind of madness in the forest. There's a kind of madness that Lear has, but that madness goes with insight. So madness is, I think, similar to Hamlet. Right?
Yes,
there's
the balance between real insanity and the sort of not feigned but also acted, taken on. Mm-hmm. Do you think, in a sense, that Lear himself also takes that on rather than lets it happen to him? It's something he takes on willingly,
or
that's a curious. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if I'm bringing up something completely foreign, but I suddenly thought, well, what if there is a choice there, even in that realm of dementia, that you can choose and you can have insight that's conscious. I mean, he's playing off of this, poor Tom, Edgar portraying madness, and
Edgar comments on that madness, right? It's in that exchange between Gloucester and Lear that I mentioned earlier, Act 4, Scene 6. There, Edgar is present, witnessing that conversation, and so there are moments when presumably Lear at that moment is mad, right?
Okay.
And what does Edgar say? He says, matter and impertinency mixed, reason and madness. And then Lear's exchange with Gloucester continues. It's interesting because it seems to me at that point that Edgar, who has assumed this role of poor mad Tom, then almost takes on the role of the Greek chorus, kind of commenting on what's going on. And there, when you see it performed, actually the National Theatre did a production of Lear recently, and it's done so well because Edgar is standing there in disguise, muddy, dirty, and Lear is sitting with Gloucester, his face is bandaged because his eyes have been put out.
Right.
And it's very clear that Edgar's role there is to kind of comment on the sanity of Lear's commentary, right? Whereas you look at political critique, often political critiques, when they're effective or true, I think, stand outside the conventional view, right? So when people adopt political standpoints of various kinds that don't fit in with the spectrum of opinion, then they will be perceived as crazy. I had a friend of mine, because of my own Marxist sympathies, tell me that I'm crazy recently.
Right.
Thank you. I mean, to me, that's if you look at that spectrum of opinion, somebody who has some kind of opinion that is not part of that spectrum is immediately going to be perceived as mad.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they're wrong. That there's not insight there. Is, I guess, the point I was making. So I don't know. I don't know if Lear chooses. I think there's more likelihood that Lear doesn't. He certainly still has maintained some aspects of maybe insight. What Edgar's commenting on is that there seems to be a kind of consistency to what he's saying, but actually the speech that he's commenting on a dog's obeyed in office, that's completely intelligible. There's nothing unintelligible about that at all. But it might be a way of Shakespeare's protecting himself. He's kind of concealing it. Here's Lear raving.
Right, but he's
delivering probably
something within that context.
What I actually think is the most cutting political critique, perhaps, in all of his work.
Wow.
Is that speech, because he basically shows the illegitimacy of all political authority. And to me, I think about it often. Actually, the idea that none offend when the system of justice is so flawed that none can offend. and that therefore none should be judged. As Lear says in that speech, thou rascal beetle, referring to his own desire to use the whore that he whips in the same way that he's punishing her for, right? So this keen understanding of political hypocrisy and the illegitimacy of all political power. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. It was pretty. That's a radical critique of political power. Yeah. And so I believe it's there. I don't think that those kinds of critiques are imposed at all. It's right there in the language. As long as it's in the language, I think, and you can find it. I think there are things often imposed. Things can be imposed, but in this case, no. I think Shakespeare is so engaged with political problems and cultural conflict that it's right there for us to see, right in the language.
John, what about this idea of an individual as a garden that could go to seed and be overtaken by weeds, and of the state equally as a garden? Don't we have that in Richard III in an overt way where
it's Richard II.
Richard II. That's what I meant, where there is a gardener.
Yeah, the image of the garden and the gardener comes up often. It's also in Othello. But in Richard II, it's where the queen is walking in her garden, and the gardener and his assistant have a conversation about the fact that Richard has been deposed. Right,
and she's learning this.
She's hearing it for the first time, but we hear the gardener compare his work of pruning back the trees and bushes and flowers in the garden as a task that if only Richard had performed well, he would not have been deposed, right? So the idea of England as a garden is an image that shows up a lot in Shakespeare, and the idea of Richard II as a poor ruler, because he doesn't know, instead of encouraging the pruning of the garden and encouraging virtue, really, he has himself as I think Joan of Gaunt earlier in the play suggests, he's sold England out. He's rented it out to others by what Richard has done is he's confiscated too much property from his nobility than they're willing to tolerate. Okay. Right? And he's gone into debt to them beyond their tolerance. This is why he so readily loses power to Bolingbroke, because they're no longer willing to suffer under his constant demands and excessive taxation, right? So, but I think the idea that he's encouraged the weeds rather than pruning back and prudently tending to the Garden of England is implied there. And then the Queen, after hearing this and sort of chides the gardener for saying this, but it's a mechanism for criticism, right? And to provide us with one perspective on Richard, but I think it's a complicated one, because Richard, that whole play revolves around the problem of divine right. So how can the divinely appointed representative of God be deposed? Right? And after you do that, which is what Bolingbroke does, there can, in some sense, no longer be any political legitimacy. So here, and I think it's the whole Henriette that investigates this, once Richard II is deposed by Bolingbroke, the whole question of political legitimacy dominates the next three plays. It dominates Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. It dominates Henry V, because Bolingbroke or Hal or Henry V, they can't be legitimate because they've deposed the rightful king, but they know how to perform legitimacy well, and so they rule well. Bolingbroke's clearly the better ruler. He will not overtax his nobility. He's not. He will tend to the Garden of England, but he's not legitimate. So I think Shakespeare also understands that at root. And I think this comes out in all the four plays, Richard II through Henry V, is that there is no such thing as political legitimacy. I connect it to Lear and Shakespeare pointing out that radical idea that there is no political legitimacy, that it's a land grab. And who can keep it? Who can keep the power? I see the whole Henry plays as doing that, even though Henry V is brilliant at evoking these patriotic images of England, but they're consistently undercut throughout the play by irony, which shows that there's a performative nature to political power, and that those who perform well, who play the role well, can hold on to power. And those who, they also need, of course, a Machiavellian approach to politics too, that allows them to scheme appropriately enough to keep power. Although I think that Shakespeare, even though he sees it breaking down, that the fact that there is no real moral legitimacy to political rule means that you have these periodic bloodlettings on a massive scale, because legitimacy, the very legitimacy that Henry IV and Henry V pretend to have, necessitates them actually letting blood and threatening to let blood in order to keep that power. We can also see the image of gardening one other place that's relevant, I think, to corruption, that is in Othello, because Iago uses it very self-consciously with Rodrigo. He basically tells him that every person is his own garden, and if one wills it, one can tend that garden and make oneself into whatever one wants, if one has the will to shape oneself. And that shaping involves also manipulating and shaping others. Edmund in the King Lear uses a similar image, by the way, too. So that image of the Machiavellian manipulator imposing his own will on himself to shape himself into the kind of person he wants is presented in Shakespeare, but also criticized, because those characters always come to a bad end and drag a lot of people with them.
It's like sort of like creating a machine of yourself. The whole idea of control, being stone cold.
That's right. But I think Shakespeare thinks that that's impossible, because I think we have Iago with this perfect confidence that he is going to mold himself, manipulate the situation around him to his own advantage. I mean, he tells us in the very first act, first page of the play, he tells us that there are two different kinds of people. There's the loyal servant, who wears himself out like his master's ass for naught but provender, as Iago tells us. And then there are others who, while throwing shows of service upon their lords, do well by them, and when they've lined their coats, prove themselves to be master. Right? And so Iago is so completely confident that he can shape and manipulate the world around him, and that he can shape and manipulate himself. But I think what Shakespeare shows us with Iago is, because there's a certain moment in the play where his actions become, or maybe a better way of putting that, let me take a step back, not that they become irrational, but the view that you can even shape yourself and control everyone around you so thoroughly is irrational, for two reasons. One, because you can't really predict events outside yourself. But I think the other, more subtle one that Shakespeare presents to us is the idea that Iago at a certain point goes off the rails.
Yeah, he's driven by emotion,
by an irrational impulse that I think Shakespeare is telling us is part of human nature. So the idea that you can rationally shape yourself implies that you can have complete mastery and understanding and control over your own desires, and even Iago doesn't. He goes in a direction that can't possibly benefit him in the way that he describes that he's going to shape himself. And so I think there Shakespeare reveals to us that human desire or impulses are not under anybody's control, really. Which I think relates back to that sonnet again,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
And we see the similar thing in Romeo and Juliet, in the Queen Mab speech that Mercutio presents, where really what Shakespeare's talking about is the unconscious. I think, before we have that concept. But Queen Mab comes in her chariot and plants these destructive desires in all these individuals. And in the Mab speech, we get a list of all these destructive acts, right, that people commit seeking their own desire or advantage. And it's Queen Mab, sort of implanting these desires in people when they sleep, which is fascinating, actually, for the way it prefigures Freud in some ways. Shakespeare knows about the unconscious. He doesn't have the word for it, but so, and I think Iago too. It's his destructiveness is bottomless. He doesn't have control over himself. Right? He's not able to guard. He's not able to cultivate himself the way he wants. But Shakespeare, I think, is profoundly pessimistic about any of us doing that. I think Shakespeare is fascinated with ideals and the inability of humans to attain them. There are a few figures who are so thoroughly attainments of those ideals in his work. Right? They're all rather characters who fail to attain them.
Right.
And even though they say one thing, they have a set of ideals, they don't really reach them.
No, because they're generally driven by some base passion.
That's right. That overmasters them rather than them mastering it.
Exactly.
I think that's key.
What about this idea that at the height of their emotional intensity, the sonnets reveal a Shakespeare who you could say is rehearsing for the plays? I think Ray and I have felt this, that in reading the sonnets, we really are reading the same author in terms of his ability to express human emotion at its extreme, where it's almost over the edge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that not only is he rehearsing the emotion, but he's also rehearsing the thematic concerns that are found in all of his plays. I think that certainly those moments of intense emotion that his characters experience at moments of crisis in the play seem to be condensed in the sonnets, right? In a very, very, in a much more condensed form, in the form of the sonnet, right? So that they're there, right?
Tightened in, caged in.
Caged in, yeah.
But when you're in that cage and you have to accomplish the same thing as you would as a free man, sometimes you can.
Well, that's
you can hone
that's the
even
thing
better.
About verse, right? I mean, he's constrained by form, right? But when you find the freedom in the form to kind of express those ideas, that's when. Right, that's when they work.
When it really goes,
I definitely see the thematic concerns too being rehearsed. I think the concern with the ideal, the corruption of the ideal, notion of time and humanity's place in time, romantic love, and what it means. Is it ennobling, or is it just lust? Idealized, right? These are the kinds of questions.
Or a form of slavery.
Or a form of enslavement as well. I mean, all these things come up intensely in Romeo and Juliet, right? Where Mercutio keeps telling Romeo, just find someone else, sleep with somebody else, and you'll get over this, And there's truth to that, right? Because he's kind of in love with Rosalind, and then and is pining over how his love will not be it's unrequited, and he's chosen someone who's taken a vow of chastity so that it can't be requited, and then he sees Juliet, and it's instantly he's fallen in love with her. I think a lot of people forget about this play, that it only takes place over 3 days. So when you think about, Romeo's yearning and his, the longing that he has for Juliet and the permanence of their love, it's 3 days. Give Romeo another couple of days, he might have lived, right? I mean, I'm serious about it. It's like, I think you can read that play as Romeo being a kind of posing or playing the romantic role. He's already read sonnets. And he's influenced by them. I think that's one of the fascinating things about the play, and also about Shakespeare's sonnets, is that the form is well established. when Shakespeare's writing it, right? The Petrarchan sonnet is well established, and people are writing them, but I don't think they're writing them with the cutting edge that Shakespeare is writing them. I don't think they're introducing the kind of problems that Shakespeare introduces in them. And so I think we see in the sonnets the same problems that we see in the plays, and there are wonderful sonnets, right, that talk about the permanency of love, right, that idealize love, and then there are others that convey it as completely false, right, and as an act, as a set of acts that people perform that are lies, as in one of the sonnets, right, or where the image of lying with and lying in the last two lines, right, conveys that. So I think Shakespeare is profoundly suspicious of love, but he also finds it ennobling. And so, in the same way that we can read sonnets that endorse that idea of romantic love as ennobling, we also find ones that tend to point out or suggest that it's a complete farce, right? That it's lust, just given decoration with language, right? I think it's interesting. There's a wonderful image in Flaubert's Madame Bovary, where Flaubert is talking about language. He refers to language as a cracked cauldron that we knock out tunes for dancing bears when we want to conjure pity from the stars. And there's this idea of language here as this flawed mechanism by which we give our desires or our wants some kind of ennobling illusion. I think Flaubert gets that from Shakespeare. I think that the idea is very much a Shakespearean notion that if you look at more than one sonnet and you see these ones that reinforce romantic love and the ones that direct criticism at it, well, in Romeo and Juliet, you see both of those things on display. You have Romeo representing that, and Mercutio keeps telling him, hey, go find someone else, or delivering. Mercutio is the one who delivers the Queen Mab speech, right? Saying, listen, this has nothing to do with what you think it does, right?
Here.
He's constantly bringing it down to just sex for Mercutio. And everything else is idealized in language.
So there is a dialogue in the sonnets, a dramatic dialogue.
I think if you read more than one, I think there's dialogues within some of them, but I think if you look overall at the things they have to say about love or time or political power, there are different views presented. A dialogue that is parallel with the dialogue that is set up in Shakespeare's plays, all of them. Those things are put on display in comedy, in tragedy, and what we call history plays and romances in different ways, but they're all there. You can think of Tempest, which is about political power too, and its use or misuse, right? And Prospero can be read either way. It can be read as the kind of the benevolent political ruler, or as somebody manipulating everybody in the play to kind of get himself back into power and assume and ensure his dynasty. I have a colleague, and we team taught a course on the Tempest, and I basically read it as an allegory for colonialism. And he, as a philosopher, wanted to read Prospero as the philosopher king, which I think makes sense because both of those readings are there. He's investigating the possibility of the just use of political power, and also the other possibility that there's no such thing. All right? So...